Right, hello everybody, and thank you for coming to this second of our Dracula Lunchtime Bites series. I'll introduce the speaker in a minute, but just before I do, let me tell you a bit about the project that this is all about. So this is part of the Dracula Returns to Derby project, which is all about recognizing and celebrating all the connections between Dracula and Derby, and there are lots. It was in Derby that the stage play of Dracula was first performed, and that created the image of Dracula, this sinister kind of lounge lizard in evening dress that we know today. And Bela Lugosi, the actor who was most closely associated with Dracula on screen, actually came to Derby a number of times in the 1950s to perform the role there. So this project is all about that. You can find details on the project website, and also you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and I'll put links in the text. But without further ado, can I introduce you to today's speaker, who's Dr. Sam George from the University of Hertfordshire, and she's going to talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula. So Sam, over to you.
Hi, thanks everyone. I'm just going to get my slides up before I begin. Here we go. Yeah, so the title of my talk is Bram Stoker's Vampire. Bram Stoker's Dracula was first published in 1897. The novel has never been out of print, and it's been translated into over 50 languages. Stoker's vampire has spawned over 1,000 films. The Count is the most filmed character ever, even surpassing Sherlock Holmes. Though it's been over 100 years since the death of Bram Stoker, interest in his charismatic vampire has never waned. In Whitby Library, Bram Stoker found Wilkinson's book on Wallachia and Moldavia, in which he first located the name Dracula. His typed notes show it was the connection with the devil that most interested him, rather than any links to Vlad the Impaler, which many see as the historical Dracula. This document is considered by some to be Dracula's birth certificate. You can see the notes that he made there on the devil. These notebooks, containing 7 years of research, include obviously typewritten notes and handwritten material. And the notebooks show that it took 7 years to research the novel. The notebooks were sold to Sotheby's by his widow Florence in 1913, and they're now housed in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. They tell us that the novel is the result of in-depth research between the years 1890 to 1897. And these notebooks were very much the inspiration behind my own interest in vampires. In 2010, when I developed the Open Graves, Open Minds project at the University of Hertfordshire, I was struck by the irony of creatures with no reflection becoming such a pervasive reflection of modern culture. My research developed directly out of this meditation on the vampire's reflection or shadow. Bram Stoker's Dracula famously throws no shadow, though he's long been associated with darkness and shade. So the folklore of the shadow is connected to the figure of the vampire in many regions of Eastern Europe. So, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, there is a folkloric belief that a vampire is a dead person's shadow. Hence, the creature doesn't cast a reflection or shadow itself. Shadow traders were common in Romania, according to Emily Gerard, whose Transylvanian superstitions was one of the sources for Stoker's novel. They traded shadows to architects who attempted to secure or wall up a person's shadow, with the result that after death, that person would become a vampire. In many cultures, the shadow and the mirror image are both unmistakably associated with the soul. Shadowy images, including the photograph, were seen as part of the person and not just optical phenomena. Bram Stoker showed the soulless vampire to be an unmirrorable image, a creature virtually beyond representation, assuming multiple forms. Without his mirror image, Dracula becomes a profoundly unsettling figure. In the novel, the vampire's lack of a reflection, the unseen face in the mirror, is first revealed to us in a scene with Harker. On arriving at Castle Dracula, Harker is quick to observe that in none of the rooms is there a mirror. As he gets the little shaving glass from his bag and hangs it by the window, he's approached by the Count. So this is a quote from the novel. Suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard the Count's voice saying, "Good morning." I started, for it amazed me that I had not seen him, since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me. In starting, I had cut myself slightly, but did not notice it at the moment. Having answered the Count's salutation, I turned to the glass again to see how I had been mistaken. This time there could be no error, for the man was close to me, and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of a man in it, except myself. Dracula reacts violently to this foul bauble of man's vanity, the mirror, which has betrayed his secret, hurling it out of the window, where it smashes into 1,000 pieces on the stone courtyard below. The trope of the vampire's missing reflection has always intrigued scholars. So my aim in this talk is to take this phenomena back to its beginning, to the evidence in the Dracula notebooks in the Rosenbach Museum, Stoker's research notes for the novel, and to simply pose the question, did Stoker sit down at his desk one day and invent the mirror non-reflection motif? And what did Bram Stoker actually know about vampires? Well, he would be familiar with various early European treatises on vampires, such as Calmet's On the Apparition of Spirits and On Vampires and Reverence of Hungary and Moravia, etc. It was this work, written in 1746 by a French monk, that famously gave writers access to a number of encounters with vampires. It was translated and popularised as The Phantom World in 1850 in 2 volumes. Also, being Irish, Bram Stoker would be aware of the myth of the Irish vampire king, who was immortalised through ancient Celtic lore. He was slain with a yew sword and buried with his feet towards the sky. A large stone cross and thorns were placed on the grave, together with branches of rowan to hinder his return. Thorns on the grave will prevent the dead from wandering, and rowan offers protection against these dark enchantments. He was also aware, Stoker, of the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who dates back to the 1600s. She features a lot in his notebooks. Bathory, as a means of returning her youth and beauty, murdered servant girls so that she could bathe in their blood. It's impossible to say how many girls were sacrificed at Bathory's hand, but estimates range from 50 to 200. Interestingly, there's no mention of mirrors in relation to vampires in the folkloric sources that Stoker mentions in the notebooks. Emily Gerard's Transylvanian Superstitions or The Land Beyond the Forest, for example. Nor is there any material on this phenomena in Vampires in New England, the article Stoker found during a trip to New York in 1896, or in the entry on vampires in the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1888, which he had consulted. Dracula's literary precursors, so there are a number of other vampire novels around before Dracula. Polidori's The Vampire, Reimer's Varney the Vampire, The Penny Dreadful, Le Fanu's Carmilla. These all similarly lack any reference to this particular aspect of vampire lore. The truth is that despite much speculation that the silver in mirrors is repellent to the vampire, a trait borrowed from werewolves, we still don't know with any certainty how the non-reflection motif came about. But one thing that fascinated me from the beginning is how much werewolf there is in Stoker's vampire. His notebooks show his obsession with the werewolf and the details he picked up from reading Sabine Baring-Gould's Book of Werewolves from 1865. Gould informs us that a werewolf may easily be detected even when devoid of his skin, for his hands are broad and his fingers are short, and there are always some hairs in the hollow of his hand. And Stoker's Dracula bears the marks of the werewolf, hairy palms, pointy ears, eyebrows that meet in the middle. And he can assume the form of a wolf or large dog. He can also command the wolves and other creatures of the night, including bats, rats, and owls. So it raises the question, could this uber-vampire Dracula actually be a werewolf? Sabine Baring-Gould, Stoker's source, elaborates on the werewolf's relationship to the vampire and how it loses its soul. The Greek werewolf is closely related to the vampire. The lycanthropist, the werewolf, falls into a cataleptic trance during which his soul leaves his body and enters that of a wolf. After death, the lycanthropist becomes a vampire. So in light of this, and of the idea of the shadow soul, I began to wonder if Stoker's imagining of the vampire casting no reflection is just an elaborate metaphor for its lack of soul. Dracula throws no shadow and casts no reflection. He has no soul, as physical existence and appetite are all that really concern him. Paul Barber's work on the folkloric vampire sheds some further light on this, documenting the importance of mirrors as soul traps. They can contain the soul of the dead in the form of a reflection, hence they are turned to the wall when someone dies or when a corpse is in a room. This practice is still very prominent in Ireland even today. So we can understand this more if we think about what Stoker was reading again. One of the books in Stoker's library was a copy of G.S. Fraser's folkloric and anthropological work, The Golden Bough. The first edition of this work recorded the law and taboo of the mirror and the shadow in 1890, at the time when Bram Stoker, J.M. Barrie and Oscar Wilde were all writing. All of these writers were influenced by The Golden Bough. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, for example, reimagines the folk belief that the soul is evinced by the shadow. Peter is another manifestation of a kind of folkloric demon who, like Dorian Gray, loses his shadow or soul, but remains supernaturally young, as does Dracula. So Fraser also documents the widespread custom of covering up mirrors or turning them to the wall after a death has taken place. It is feared that the soul projected out of the person in the shape of his reflection in the mirror may be carried off, he writes. We can again see the importance of mirrors as soul traps. The looking glass was also rendered a portal through which spirits passed to cross over to the next world, and by extension, it served as a gateway through which the devil could enter the world. Shadows are undoubtedly connected to superstitions about vampires, but the role played by mirrors is harder to gauge with any certainty. What we do know is that when mirrors became prevalent in households across Europe, they assumed a more seminal role in fairy tales and folklore, invested with magical and supernatural meaning. Believed to represent the souls of sacred and divine figures, they supposedly also housed the spirits of the dead. Of course, mirrors were also used to create the vampire on stage in the early 19th century, a technique developed for early melodramas such as Planchet's The Vampire or Bride of the Isles, staged at the Lyceum in London in 1820. Phantasmagoria saw the rising of the dead on stage in productions such as Pepper's Ghost, where mirrors and reflections were used again. So a little bit of, again, smoke and mirrors here. These vampire theatricals predate Dracula, and Stoker was aware of earlier optical effects, especially the vampire trap, immersed as he was in the culture of the 19th century theatre. So I wondered if the Dracula notebooks contained evidence of Stoker's own thoughts on mirrors. Leafing through the handwritten pages, I stumbled immediately on a reference to mirrors. As early as page 3, Stoker writes, "No looking glasses in Count's house, never can see him reflected in one, no shadow." Then on page 4 he elaborates further. "Painters cannot paint him, their likeness always like someone else, could not Kodak him," meaning photograph him, "come out black like a skeletal corpse." So what I found in the notebook entries was surprising because emerging from all the drawings and notes was a very unique record of developing theories of mechanical reproduction. In writing the novel, Stoker's research was not confined to folklore. It extended to aesthetic debates, ideas around new technology, in particular the birth of photography. There are multiple references to new recording techniques in Dracula: the camera, the phonograph, the typewriter. All of these are used by the crew of Light in an attempt to track down and document the non-reflecting vampire. Harker's use of the camera in the novel can be seen to demonstrate these processes. It marks a kind of new vogue for photoconsumerism. He takes views of the Carfax estate from various points and uses his Kodak in the services of real estate, but tellingly, he never attempts to photograph the Count. The vampire's lack of a reflection or image in a photograph is symbolic of a tension between old world views colliding with contemporary modes of production. The snapshot camera so many people were wielding at the time is also a celluloid example, a kind of analogue of vampirism in action. The mirror with a memory is a term used for photography, and it invites us to see the photograph in Dracula as an extension of the mirror image motif. Stoker's shadowless Count does not show up in a photograph. He comes out black like a skeleton corpse. So we're actually nearer to the X-ray than the photograph in Stoker's imagining of this image. In 1896, close to the date when the novel was published, Röntgen made a picture of his wife's hand formed through X-rays on a photographic plate. This was the first ever photograph of the human body part using X-rays. Interestingly, on seeing the picture, his wife believed she had seen her own death. This whiff of the grave is evocative of the figure of the vampire, and it indicates wider fears over the new medium of photography. In 1902, it was noted that farmers in the north of Greece were afraid of the photograph. Their souls might be captured if their pictures were taken. These ideas can be traced again back to Fraser, who describes how villagers betray a horror in relation to the photograph and hide away whenever the lens of a camera, or the evil eye of the box, as they call it, is turned upon them, because they thought it took their souls away. In Stoker, the Kodak camera is the mirror with a memory, which threatens to betray the Count's secret. Dracula marks a unique historical moment when vampirism in literature surfaces in response to mechanical reproduction and the new media of photography and film. Perhaps, too, unease over new technologies is wedded to deeper anxieties around scientific discovery and its challenge to Christianity. A satirical cartoon from the 19th century shows Darwin and an ape looking at their likeness in a mirror. Stoker's refusal to allow us to acknowledge our likeness to Dracula, we cannot see a reflection, is perhaps symptomatic of wider anxieties around our kinship with the soulless or animal other. Brought about by Darwin's evolutionary theories. Remember, Darwin argued that we have a common ancestor in the ape. Dracula, interestingly, is very animal. He can control certain animals, and he can shapeshift himself into a wolf or large dog. And he appears as a kind of lizard-like reptilian creature, scaling the walls of his castle. But perhaps Renfield, the maniacal character controlled by Dracula, is the vehicle for these Darwinian ideas in the novel. I want no souls. Life is all I want, he says. So in the novel, Van Helsing is the vampire hunter, and he perpetuates the myth of Dracula's lost reflection, informing his associates that the vampire throws no shadow, he make in the mirror no reflection. A scientist, philosopher, and metaphysician, he must explain the existence of vampires to all the non-believers. I have trained myself to keep an open mind, he reports. So it is actually in sympathy with our Open Graves, Open Minds project, I always think. He informs his associates that Dracula can grow and become small. He can at times vanish and become unknown. He's timeless. He's known everywhere that man has been. He cannot die by the mere passing of time. He also has the aids of necromancy, which means that he has control over the dead. However, the most important clue to his true nature is that he has no likeness, no shadow, and no photographic image, and he cannot be tracked by these means. This suggests his undead and demonic status. Folkloric imagery around shadows is consistently demonic. So, for example, the dead in purgatory don't cast shadows on the ground. Stith Thompson's volume of folk literature similarly informs us that demons cast no shadow. The motive of Dracula's lost reflection is carried through from the novel into film. There's some quite fun examples of this. So there's a non-reflection scene in Todd Browning's 1931 film Dracula. In the film, Dracula is detected because he casts no reflection in Van Helsing's cigarette case. At this point, I start to ask myself, what does Dracula see in the mirror? I became fascinated by this idea. A reflection in the mirror is half the size of what is reflected. Perhaps a vampire reflects back a reflection. So the reflection is reflected back and forth an infinite number of times, becoming infinitely small. Perhaps that's what Count Dracula sees when he looks in the cigarette case. Or perhaps for a vampire, the image is doubled in size. Then the vampire sees his image reflected back and forth, doubling until it's infinitely large. Perhaps that sight is what scares the vampire. Given the folklorist account of mirrors as soul traps, it's not inconceivable that Dracula does see something. Or like Dorian Gray, he's confronted with his own blackened soul trapped there. Hence his violent reaction. He knocks the mirror to the floor. And Kim Newman addresses this idea of what vampires see in his novel Anno Dracula. His character Lord Riven claims, "It's untrue that vampires lack a reflection. It's just that the reflection invariably does not reflect, as it were, what is out here in the world." The problem of photographing vampires is also given some creative consideration through Newman's Lord Godalming. Some disappeared completely, while others were an apparently empty suit of clothes. This is explained at the expense of modern technology, as only a painter can capture the inner man. Human genius shall always be superior to mechanical chemical trickery. Newman's vampire can be painted, whereas Dracula shows no likeness in any media. I think what's interesting about this is in the 20th century, the figure of the non-reflecting vampire was to be transformed and reanimated by its appropriation in film. In 1896, Maxim Gorky described the effect of the newly invented cinematograph itself as entering the kingdom of shadows. So just kind of the cinema itself was a kind of entering of shadows. German expressionist filmmakers used the shadow metaphorically to give added, often very uncanny meaning to the nature of projection. The vampire's shadow was restored via these techniques. So many of the unsettling effects in early vampire film, Murnau's Nosferatu, 1922, Carl Dreyer's Vampire, 1932, come from making play with the fiend's menacing shadow, despite Dracula not having one. Perhaps the old not visible in a mirror trick is now outmoded following the development of film, and this is something that I've thought about. The mirror motif is hard to square with practicalities, especially if extended to photography in all its forms. So Anne Rice's vampires can be seen in a looking glass, and that runs into many recent vampire franchises. Televisual vampires post Buffy the Vampire Slayer are most often reflected in mirrors and can be photographed. Vampires in Buffy and Angel, they don't cast reflections, but they can be recorded on video. But if we return to the 19th century, Oscar Wilde's themes around mirroring, reproduction and reflection, and lack of soul in Dorian Gray, find their way into the supernatural machinery of Dracula, in the soulless motif of the vampire not reflecting in the mirror. Mirrors are undoubtedly connected to the soul in Wilde, and Dorian reacts violently to them at times in the novel, kind of foreshadowing Dracula. Flinging the mirror on the floor, he crushed it into silver splinters beneath his heel. It doesn't seem far-fetched to see Dorian as influential on Stoker's representation of Dracula. Superstitions around vampires and myths around the shadowy origins of art converge in the vampire portrait of Dorian Gray. And the Golden Bough, again, housed in Stoker's library, extends to an analysis of superstitions and taboos around the shadow, and it includes the portrait. So I'm just going to read this quotation. As with shadows and reflections, so with portraits, they often are believed to contain the soul of the person portrayed. People who hold this belief are naturally loath to have their likeness taken, for if the portrait is the soul, or at least a vital part of the person portrayed, whoever possesses the portrait will be able to exercise fatal influence over the original of it. You can see how that is played out very much in the novel Dorian Gray. So, just to sum up then, this reference to folkloric sources has allowed us to come full circle, gesturing back to the Dracula notebooks that were our starting point. Stoker's novel responds playfully to the vampire through gesture, because the vampire body is defined by motifs and constructed through devices, so it's all kind of made up of motifs and devices. Dracula is, in short, Van Helsing's bag of tricks brought to life. I began at the outset with the thought that the vampire not reflecting in a mirror may have fallen out of favour, but the vampire still refuses to show a likeness of its own, yet holding a glass up to ourselves, it perpetually mirrors modern culture. Thank you. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about this research, this essay that this talk has come from is published in the Open Graves, Open Minds book, and you can contact me there via email or through social media. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. That was great, and that really highlighted the importance of the shadow to Dracula. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, either type it into chat or just unmute and ask the question. Okay, I'll ask one while we're waiting. Is it the case that Bram Stoker kind of invented a lot of the characteristics of the vampire as we understand them today? You know, that they weren't things that were already around. He kind of embellished and added and enhanced what was already known.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I very much see the novel as kind of building up the whole vampire lore that was then sort of debunked in later novels, such as Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire Demo. She talks about everything from crucifixes to sleeping in a coffin as not being true. But within the novel Dracula, it's at the point in which all this vampire lore is being beautifully kind of created and built up. Yeah, so we get all the classic ideas about, you know, the vampire sleeping in the coffin, the vampire having to have its native soil with it, which Dracula takes through on the ship when he comes to England. Yeah, so and it's Van Helsing really as the vampire hunter who really kind of elaborates on what the nature of Dracula is, including his lack of reflection, you know, the ideas about his not being photographed. These are all new. I mean, I mentioned in the talk that they don't appear in any of Stoker's sources, so we can only conclude that, yeah, these come from Stoker's own imagination and how fascinating they are because of that.
Okay, we've had another question in chat from Amber. How does the idea of the Jungian shadow connect with your research? I wouldn't know how to answer that. I hope.
Yeah,
you're
no,
okay.
it's a very interesting idea. I must admit, in my research, I kind of deliberately avoided any kind of psychological approach because I wanted to go back to the folklore. So once you start thinking about Jung, Freud, etc., you sort of get carried in a very different direction. But obviously there is a relationship there. Freud isn't, you know, does kind of correspond with the era in which Stoker was writing. But I do see this as very folkloric in the way that Stoker references it. There's a lot of magic and kind of supernatural elements that are not really coming from early psychology. And obviously he was interested in dreams, as was Jung and Freud. But I very much see the idea of the mirror, the idea of the shadow, as coming from folkloric ideas about the dead and about souls. That's the conclusion that I came to anyway. But obviously, Jung, etc., went on to develop a whole idea about the shadow, which is still very prominent today.
Brilliant, thank you. It's just gone one, so I think we have to stop there. But on behalf of everybody, can I say thank you to Sam for a fascinating talk, and please feel free to use the response icons to give her a round of applause. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Really nice to see you.